Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Season 4, Episode 39. Your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. Lawyers, because people are dumb. The Sean Combs edition. That's right, I've been putting off talking about this story for a week or two. No longer. In Major League Baseball, the National League has 2 playoff spots for 3 baseball teams, all tied going into the last 2 days of the season. Thank you to all of my loyal listeners. If you're new to this podcast, please like, subscribe, thumbs up, 5-star, write a review, send to friends and enemies far and wide. This Is Why I Don't Vote podcast is commercial free. Would I like to get some sponsors? In my most effective Colonel Jessup, you're goddamn right I would. But for now, it's just you, dear listener. It's just you. This Is Why I Don't Vote podcast is on Patreon. Please consider supporting.
Act 1 Lawyers, because people are dumb. Sean Combs edition.
Lawyers, because people are dumb. Sean Combs edition. I held off on doing any kind of piece on Sean Combs and his, predilections, mainly because it was a pretty straightforward case. It was a very Harvey Weinstein type case. Here's a guy who had power within the industry. He used that power to subjugate, humiliate other people, and frankly, they allowed it to happen because that's how bad they wanted to make it in the music industry. But I learned some details about this whole situation with one Cassie, and it fit right into the segment that I wanted to do. I wanted to have as a recurring segment, the lawyers because people are dumb. And this time, that dumb person is one Sean Combs. What was the detail that I learned about the whole situation that he had with Cassie that prompted me to do this piece? Well, I wasn't aware that this artist, Cassie, had a sophomore album that was produced by one Sean Combs that took 10 years to actually finish. In retrospect, in light of everything that we know now, of course, Combs was just stringing this girl along to keep her around. Even though she had a debut album that was very successful, he was keeping her in this state of suspension, in this state of suspended animation, where her loyalty was with Sean Combs because he was producing this album, and she probably had some sort of affection for him. Maybe you could even call it love. But he was using that as an opportunity to keep her in the fold, so to speak, so she would do whatever he asked of her in these freak-offs. The whole situation with Sean Combs culminated in the filing of a lawsuit by this Cassie in New York State under a sunset law, which basically means that the state of New York said, even if an incident occurred, a sexual assault, a sexual abuse, and the statute of limitations in this state has run. So you have no recourse, not only in criminal law, because the event happened so long ago and there's very likely no forensic evidence. It's just a he said, she said situation. Even in civil law, because the statute of limitations run, you have no relief. Well, we're going to give you this window of opportunity. You can still file that lawsuit within a window of time, according to this sunset law, this statute. And if you file the lawsuit within the window of time, essentially the statute of limitations doesn't apply, or as they say in the law, it tolls. So this Cassie runs out, files a lawsuit. Combs immediately settles it, and it is under a confidentiality agreement, so we don't know how much money was tendered to this woman to settle the lawsuit, but just the very allegations in the civil complaint gave rise to a criminal investigation, and that criminal investigation has led to the downfall of the empire of Combs. Cassie is heralded as a hero for standing up bravely and filing this suit, accusing this victimizer, this predator of all of these things that she had to suffer through, placing herself in that focused spotlight. That's pretty much the narrative that we've been fed, and that narrative is slowly crumbling, and that's what I want to talk about. Lawyers because people are dumb, Sean Combs segment is not so much that Combs settled this lawsuit with Cassie immediately after it was filed, it's that the lawsuit was ever filed in the first place. Let's begin with the narrative that this Cassie character, by filing the lawsuit under the Sunset Law in the state of New York, is somehow a hero. The woman is not a hero. She simply took the next step in a series of steps that she had already taken, and she was fully aware that she was in the driver's seat. This was not a woman who was subjecting herself to the scrutiny of the media, given the climate, given the allegations, given the video that had already come out showing that Combs beat the shit out of her in a hotel room. She escaped. He beats the shit out of her in a hotel hallway and drags her back to the room. No, it goes much deeper than that. As it turns out, this artist, Cassie, writes a book. Now, who knows how extensive the book was or is? Who knows what was in the manuscript of the book? But there is a manuscript of a book that outlined, well, that's probably the wrong word, that detailed all of the things that Combs did to this woman over the course of that 10, 12-year relationship that they had, the nature of these quote-unquote freak-offs. And Cassie approached Combs and his team and said, look, if you want me to be quiet, if you want this book, this manuscript to never see the light of day, pay me $30 million. That's 30 million, $30 million. I don't have the exact dates as to when this overture was made, but in my understanding of the timeline, Cassie drafted this manuscript and sent it to Combs prior to New York State had passed that legislation for the Sunset Law. In other words, New York State had not yet created the legislation that allowed a victim to file a suit in civil court for a sexual crime where the statute of limitations had already run. That did not yet exist. Because that did not yet exist, Cassie did the next best thing. She drafted a manuscript for a book that looked like it could be shopped to publishers, saying, I'm going to expose you in this book if you don't pay me $30 million. Now, Combs, for his part, given that he's a billionaire and that he has so much influence not only over the media in the music industry, not only the media in Hollywood, but the media in general, he felt very confident that A, I can refute the allegations in this book, and given the fact that this woman has asked me for $30 million in light of this transcript, it's going to be very easy to discredit her by saying all of the allegations in that book are bullshit. And one of the things that's going to lead you to conclude as much is the fact that she's trying to extort me for $30 million in order to buy the rights to this manuscript. So this is, for all intents and purposes, a very polished, sophisticated blackmail scheme. And then what do? What is the icing on that cake? What do you throw on top of it? B, she wanted to do all those things. So to the extent that any of it's true, she was into it. This is just sour grapes because we're no longer in a relationship and she no longer has her music career and she's looking to cash in on my name without the backdrop of a legal proceeding in order to have witnesses deposed, in order to subpoena documents. This is a good he said, she said. I gave this guy the best years of my life. He ruined my opportunity to have a musical career. He degraded me in all these sexual acts. And then Combs comes back and says she turned what was consensual sexual activities between two adults into blackmail, and I'm not going to pay it. No doubt, Combs would then go to many of the other principals, these third parties that were involved in all of these activities, and either pay them off or intimidate them not to corroborate Cassie's story. Then, New York State passes this sunset law allowing victims of sexual crimes to file civil suits against their perpetrators, regardless of when they happened, regardless of when those acts took place. So they could have taken place 25 years ago. They could have taken place 15 years ago. The statute of limitations was no longer going to be a bar to those types of civil complaints. Here's where the lawyers, because people are dumb segment begins. No doubt everyone involved in Combs' legal team, in his PR team, knew of this manuscript that was drafted by Cassie. Many of them probably had read some of it. Names, dates, places, events. This was a known quantity. And because it was qualified as blackmail, and the team agreed that because of the statute of limitations, this was Cassie's only avenue to try to, I'm sure using a term of art that their team would use, that the Combs team would use, to capitalize or collect on these events, they thought they were bulletproof. In their minds, they were likely thinking, if the manuscript gets shopped, we can attack it at the publisher's level. We can attack it via PR if the book is going to get published. We can certainly go out and address this with all of the people who are named in the book. Then the sunset law gets passed. Then lawyers who were familiar with the manuscript that's out there and the demand for money that was made by Cassie, and very well may have approached one Sean Combs and said something to this effect. Hey, remember when you flew in from LA with Cassie and there was that prostitute and the midget and that 14-inch long dildo and the 55-gallon drum of baby oil? Did that occur at the Waldorf Astoria penthouse in New York City? Why, yes. Yes, it did. Why do you ask, Mr. Attorney? Oh, do you remember when you had one of your white parties that subsequently turned into a quote-unquote freak off, where a number of the biggest names in the hip-hop industry were placed in stocks and a dominatrix came and whipped them with a cat of nine tails while you anally penetrated them with your fingers and your penis and a number of different inanimate objects? Did that happen at your house in the Hamptons? Why, yes. Yes, it did. Why do you ask, Mr. Attorney? Well, because this woman now is going to be able to take all of the things that she's alleged in this manuscript, in this book, and essentially copy and paste them into allegations in a pleading and file that pleading in New York State Court, thereby making it public. And because it's a lawsuit, she's going to have the liberty to engage in discovery, and she's going to be able to depose people, and she's going to be able to subpoena documents, and it's going to be bad. It's going to be bad for you. So what we should do is settle now. We should go back to this woman before she does anything, before she hires a lawyer, or before she tells this story to anyone else, and we should take her up on the deal. We should buy that manuscript for $30 million, and this will never see the light of day. Nope, that's not what happened. We know that the lawsuit was filed. We know that those allegations were basically a roadmap for criminal prosecutors to go through on both a state and a federal level and identify all of these different potential crimes. And even though Combs settled the lawsuit as soon as it was filed, very likely for $30 million, the damage had already been done. It's possible that Combs's lawyers did not warn him that he had significant exposure because of this sunset law in the state of New York. So maybe this isn't a lawyers because people are dumb segment. Maybe it's just lawyers are dumb. Either way, knowing now the extent of all of this nefarious activity and the lack of cooperation by so many different people, it's surprising to me that this narrative was allowed to get out in a legal pleading when Combs knew of the vulnerability that he had with this woman, Cassie. This is a woman who put practically everything that they did together into a manuscript for a book that was just kind of floating out there in the ether, that maybe it comes back to bite you in a year or 2 years or 5 years, but that he just didn't resolve. And $30 million is a lot of money, don't get me wrong, but this man is allegedly a billionaire. And given the gravity, the depth of these allegations and what they could mean to someone, regardless of the amount of money that they've made, that would inspire one, you'd think, to want to eliminate that risk. Perhaps because Combs had gotten away with so much for so long. I know now he's being implicated in the murder of Tupac Shakur, that there are a number of other crimes that appears that he got away with, that he was guilty of. So perhaps the legal system was treating him like a Bill Cosby or a Jeffrey Epstein, that he had circulated around the legal system for a long time and felt like he could manipulate it. It just seemed so obvious to me that as soon as that sunset law was passed in the state of New York, that he would do something proactive to eliminate the one risk that he knew was out there. I'm sure that there are 100 other people who could have come forward and filed a suit in the state of New York because of their escapades with one Sean Combs and a cat of nine tails or a 14-inch black dildo. But the ones with Cassie were in writing. He already had the manuscript. He already knew it was out there. I don't want to be hard on Cassie. I don't buy into this narrative that the media is trying to create, that she's a hero or that she did something heroic. To be clear, if Combs had taken the deal, if he had bought that manuscript for $30 million, there may very well be a freak-off this weekend with some 16-year-old, and there would be no one who knew anything better in the public at large, any civil or criminal authority. That woman would have taken her money and run. It wasn't about the principal. She didn't file the lawsuit because of the principal. You know that's the case because she immediately settled that lawsuit. The lawsuit just gave her leverage that she didn't have when she came up with the strategy of the manuscript because of the statute of limitations issue. It's a stretch in my mind to call that woman a hero. Victim, yes. Hero, no. And perhaps Combs is like many powerful people in that the legal representation that he had wasn't the finest. They just told him the things that he wanted to hear. I'm looking at you, Donald Trump. And that's one of the reasons, one of the many, many reasons that the man finds himself in the predicament that he's in right now. To add another brick in the wall of hubris, it turns out that Combs's attorney defending him on all these charges is the same man who defended R. Kelly. R. Kelly, where have I heard that name before? Where's R. Kelly now? Oh, he's rotting his ass in jail for the rest of his life. Lawyers, because people are dumb, even if those people have made billions and billions of dollars.
Act 2. 3 teams tied for 2 playoff spots in the National League.
I had a segment already recorded for this week's podcast, and I actually, reluctantly so, deleted it so that I could do this segment. And I say reluctantly because I don't like editing something that I have to record on a Saturday morning, the Saturday that I'm going to publish the podcast. Major League Baseball playoff excitement. 3 teams tied for the last 2 playoff spots in the National League. The Diamondbacks, the Braves, and the Mets. Unfortunately for the Diamondbacks, and I say that as a resident of the Valley of the Sun, the Arizona Diamondbacks have 2 games left to try to secure their playoff spot, whereas the Braves and the Mets, because of the rain out this week in Atlanta, have 4 games left. The New York Metropolitans are finishing out their games in Milwaukee against a Milwaukee Brewers team that have already secured their playoff spot. They have nothing to play for. The Atlanta Braves are at home against the Kansas City Royals, a team that has already secured its playoff spot that has nothing to play for. And the Arizona Diamondbacks host the San Diego Padres, a team that has already secured their playoff spot and has nothing to play for. Although these 3 teams are fighting for these last 2 playoff spots, the teams that they are playing are not fighting for anything, yet they're all 3 playoff teams. It is a possibility that the Arizona Diamondbacks could face the San Diego Padres in the playoffs. It is a possibility that the New York Metropolitans could face the Milwaukee Brewers in the playoffs. And granted, it's probably a long shot, but it's a possibility that the Atlanta Braves could face the Kansas City Royals in the playoffs, that being the World Series. So one would think that these three playoff teams who don't have anything to play for may not have their foot on the gas like they would had they been fighting for a playoff spot. Yet I watched the game against the Milwaukee Brewers last night. The Brewers, a team that like to run. They like to steal bases. Well, you can get hurt stealing bases. There's a risk inherent in trying to steal a base. So the thought process of at least one Ron Darling and one Keith Hernandez, the two Mets color commentators, was that perhaps Milwaukee was not going to be as aggressive because they don't have anything to play for and they didn't want to put any of their players at risk. And that certainly wasn't the case as they stole two bases in the first inning. The Padres, for their part, don't seem to be letting up either, and that is bad news for one Arizona Diamondbacks fan because Arizona needs to win the next two baseball games. The Braves and the Mets have 2 games in hand. They get to play 2 extra baseball games to see if they can win enough in order to make the playoffs, whereas the Diamondbacks, they only have 2 more games, and they're tied with 2 other teams that have 2 games in hand. So they need to win at home against the Padres today on Saturday and tomorrow on Sunday, and then keep their fingers crossed that they are mathematically still available or eligible to make the playoffs, because then the Braves and the Mets are very likely going to have to play a doubleheader on Monday. For my part, I'd much rather see the New York Metropolitans and the Arizona Diamondbacks make the playoffs because the Mets are my team and I live in the Valley of the Sun, thereby giving me the opportunity to go see a playoff game in person. Would it be the end of the world if the Arizona Diamondbacks lost their next 2 games against the Padres, thereby making the games on Monday against the Braves and the Mets moot? No, it would not. It would not break my heart. I did get a chance to see a World Series game last year, and it would be convenient to see some playoff games this year if the Diamondbacks were in the playoffs. But this is one of those years, and they're rare, where I get to say, I really like this Mets baseball team, and I'd like to see them do well. I'd like to see Lindor be rewarded for his MVP caliber year. I'd like to see Pete Alonso, in the event that he's going to leave the New York Mets in free agency this summer, have one last opportunity to have a playoff run wearing a Mets jersey. And I'd like to see what some of these kids can do that the Mets have pulled up from their minor leagues, particularly Vientos and Acuna. Let's see the kids cut their teeth in the playoffs. As exciting a week it is in college football, with Alabama playing number 1 Georgia, thine eyes shall be focused on baseball. This is Why Don't Vote, a podcast.